Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. In today's episode, in Politics on Trial, I'm talking about an event which isn't just a trial. There isn't a single trial that's at the focus of it. It's a scandal. It became known as an affair, the Dreyfus Affair. It was a political drama. It was a social drama. It was a national psychological drama. It was something like a national nervous breakdown. But at the heart of it, the things that make sense of it, are a series of completely extraordinary legal proceedings. And that's what I want to talk about. So with Parnell, I was talking about 2 trials. With Oscar Wilde, there were 3. With Dreyfus, it's almost impossible to say how many key legal events, discrete legal events took place. There were multiple courts-martial, satisfying to be able to say the plural of court-martial, courts-martial. There was at least one very significant libel case, libel proceedings. There was at least one very significant treason trial during the Dreyfus Affair. A number of officers thought it was time for a coup d'etat, and they attempted to install a general as head of state and to effectively abolish Republican government. They were stopped, they were arrested, they were put on trial, and they were, of course, acquitted in the atmosphere, the febrile atmosphere of the time. There were military investigations, parliamentary investigations, commissions and inquiries, all of them dressed up as legal proceedings. I'm going to focus in particular on 4. So we've gone from 2 to 3 to 4. 4 here. 3 courts-martial and 1 libel case. At the heart of it, the celebrated libel case that was brought against the novelist and writer Émile Zola for his famous, notorious attack on the French military establishment, J'accuse. 3 courts-martial and a libel case. But there's much more going on than that. And in all of these proceedings, there is a distinctive character to the way in which law was used during the Dreyfus Affair. I think it's the thing that gives it its particular shape, because in the French Republic at the end of the 19th century, there was an extreme amount of legal formalism and formality. All of these proceedings were dressed up as highly regulated affairs. There were rules, there were costumes, there were protocols, there was a kind of choreography to it. Formal, almost ceremonial, and at the heart of the Dreyfus Affair, the ultimate ceremonial moment, which was, after his first conviction, Dreyfus was publicly disgraced, dishonoured. His sword was broken and his epaulettes were cut off his shoulders before he was sent away to Devil's Island as a traitor to France. He was publicly shamed in a highly ritualised ceremony. But all of it was ceremonial in that way. All of it was ritualized. Everybody was clear that the seriousness of the occasion, the seriousness of the charge against Dreyfus, which is that he had betrayed his country by selling military secrets to the Germans, the country of whom France at that time was most afraid, the country by whom France had been traumatized because of the defeat a couple of decades earlier in the Franco-Prussian War. The seriousness of what was taking place was signaled by the seriousness with which people took the legal forms. And yet in each of the cases, in each legal event that one can identify in the Dreyfus Affair, the formalities were broken, they were breached, they were ignored, they were turned into a kind of travesty, simultaneously as everybody going through the motions of being extremely rigorous about what is and isn't allowed by the rules. The rules were flagrantly broken, shockingly, in ways that don't fit any legal procedure. Not just that lies were told and forgeries were introduced, but in the courtroom itself, people who were dressed up to behave absolutely properly did shockingly improper things. And they did it in order to re-emphasize the seriousness of what they were dealing with. It's so serious it requires all of this law to deal with it, but it is so serious that the law may not be adequate to the task. And so to signal the ways in which something is going on here which is almost beyond law, we will use a court of law in order to go beyond what is allowed so that people will understand that this is as shocking as anything could be. A lot of outsiders noticed this in the Dreyfus Affair. Foreigners were fascinated by it. British newspapers, American newspapers, German newspapers. They revelled in a country, France, having a nervous breakdown. And they were completely fascinated by the weirdness of it. Queen Victoria sent her Chief Justice, a man called Lord Douglas, to watch one of the courts martial, the later one, the one in 1899, when it was thought that Dreyfus would be acquitted. And he came back and he reported that it was a baffling occasion, and he said it was typical of the failings of Roman legal systems. He thought this is what happens if you don't have a jury trial. The libel case was a jury trial, but the courts martial were all before military judges, investigating as magistrates, judge and jury. And he said what you get in these cases is people who are performing the role of law, but they don't really know how to do it because they're not lawyers. These are soldiers. These are soldiers pretending to be lawyers. So they are, on the one hand, even more sticklers for the rules, and on the other hand, breaking the rules. He thought this is what happens outside of the British system of jury trial. You always get mistakes and corruption and people unable actually to grip the matter at hand because they aren't equipped for this kind of legal procedure. They have power, but they don't have sufficient knowledge or understanding. But I don't think it's enough just to say this is what happens in Roman legal systems. This is what you get in the French system of justice. Most of the people who were watching France used it as a vehicle for their prejudice against the French, not to be trusted. There was something else going on here. This psychodrama was more than just a failure of a legal system. What it really was a pure form of what we have now come to call conspiracy theorizing. And you see this throughout the Dreyfus case. The distinctive characteristic of sophisticated conspiracy theories is that they are highly formal. So conspiracy theorizing is not on the whole wild. It's not crazy talk by crazy people. The people might be crazy, but they know that they need to dress up what they believe in something that looks as close as possible like the traditional thing, the real thing. So a conspiracy theorist will write a book which is drowning in footnotes and sources and formal proofs of things that look mad, but look, here's the evidence, here's the evidence, here's the evidence. More and more layers upon layers of formality, covering the thing at its heart, which is empty, which is hollow. And that's what happened in the Dreyfus Affair. All of this legal formality, layer upon layer of it, was there overlaying something which at its heart was empty. But the emptiness never really came through because it was almost impossible to see it through all of the layers. And the people who did see it, the people who did expose it, to start with a very small group of people, but it got bigger and bigger until the entire country, France, was divided between Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. You had to be on one or other side of this divide. But by that point, it wasn't the thing at the heart of it being contrasted with the vast conspiracy theory. It was conspiracy theory against conspiracy theory. It was the accusation that the people who had layered more and more legal nonsense on top of the empty shell, they were themselves part of a conspiracy. The truth at the heart of the Dreyfus Affair could never be seen because by the time people had decided that it was a sham, the way they wanted to expose the sham was effectively by mirroring the sham with a vast conspiracy theory of their own. And that's what France became, a land of competing conspiracy theories. So it's there right from the beginning, from the very origin of the Dreyfus Affair, which began in 1894. You can see, it's hindsight, of course, but you can see how this is going to go because of the way in which the case against Dreyfus was put together and was initially tried in a court-martial at the end of 1894. In the late summer of 1894, this started because the French secret intelligence service had a spy, a kind of spy, an insider in the German embassy. The Germans, the country they were most afraid of, the people whose secrets they most wanted to know. And this woman was a cleaner, and her job was to empty the bins. And she agreed, for money, to hand over the contents of these bins to the French intelligence services. And rummaging around in the bins, she found a document which she gave to the French, which became known as the bordereau, meaning just a slip of paper, a scrap of paper, on which was written a note to a member of the German diplomatic service, a man called Schwarzkoppen. And on it were a series of offers of information that could be handed over about the French military. So on the bordereau, this man, Schwarzkoppen, was offered information about a new gun and how it behaves, a hydraulic gun. He was offered information about troops and troop modifications and plans. He was offered information about artillery formations. He was offered, and this is what it says on the note, information relating to Madagascar. Doesn't say what it's going to be. And also he offered to supply the draft field artillery manual from March 1894. It was anonymous. There was nothing to indicate who had provided this note. It was handwritten, so there was the handwriting. But it was immediately clear that someone, probably for money, was offering to supply to the Germans information about French artillery, the guns, the troop formations, the manuals, and so on. Information compromising to the French military. This was treason. No one doubted that this was treason. There was a traitor somewhere inside the French military establishment. So the question is who? Who was it? It was worked out by the French intelligence service that the range of information that was being offered could only come from someone who worked on the general staff, because this was a wide range of different stuff. Information about weapons, about artillery formations, about troop movements, and so on. It seemed like someone who had access to lots of different bits of kinds of military information, so not a specialist, someone on the general staff. And they narrowed it down to 6 possible people. They decided that the kind of person they were looking for, with the kind of access they thought was required, would be one of these 6. And then they thought, well, the only thing we can do is to compare the handwriting. So we need 6 samples of handwriting, and we need to compare it with the note. And if there's a match, that's our guy. There wasn't a match, but there was one sample of handwriting that seemed closer than the others. And it came from a man called Alfred Dreyfus, who was on the general staff, a young officer. And so they asked themselves, well, it's not an exact match, but it's pretty close. It looks similar. Is there anything else to suggest it might be Dreyfus? And immediately they saw there was lots else to suggest it might be Dreyfus. First, Dreyfus was a Jew. And they were looking for a traitor. And this was an age of virulent, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit anti-Semitism, not just in France, not just in Europe, but it was there in French high society, including the French military. The French Republic, like many republics, had as one of its badges of honor that it had assimilated Jews into its establishment. We talked on this podcast to Chris Clark about this a lot, that one of the markers of 19th century republicanism was an attempt to confer full citizenship on Jews who had been excluded. And that meant in the army there were a number of Jewish officers who'd risen quite high. Dreyfus was one. He was a successful officer. He had passed through officer training, but there was a black mark against him, which is in his officer training, one of the assessments that they found, though he'd done very well on all of the intellectual tests, all of the tests of memory and organization and leadership, but he wasn't thought to be a team player. That was presumably straightforward anti-Semitic prejudice, but it was there as a formal assessment. This man is very good at being a soldier, but there's something off. It's all self-fulfilling. What was off is that he was a Jew, but it came out as a formal assessment. They searched his apartment and they found absolutely nothing incriminating there. And it was decided that this was more evidence against him because a spy would cover all his tracks. It was suspicious that there was nothing to incriminate him. He wasn't just Jewish, he was from Alsace. He was an Alsatian. Alsace-Lorraine, the territory, probably the closest contemporary analogy to it is Kashmir between India and Pakistan. France and Germany, it was the powder keg. It was the bit of competed territory that had been lost after the Franco-Prussian War, about which both countries were most neuralgically paranoid and about whom the inhabitants of Alsace-Lorraine, there was the greatest suspicion because it wasn't completely clear whether these people were French or German. As it happens, Dreyfus was very French. He was a true French patriot. But to the intelligence services, he looked doubly suspicious. He was a foreigner because he was a Jew. He was a foreigner because he was Alsatian. They looked into his love life. It seems likely, actually, he was, by the standards of the time, pretty faithful to his wife, Lucy, who became extraordinarily faithful to him when he was convicted and sent to Devil's Island. She tried to go with him. But he had relationships, he had friendships, tendresses, the French might say, with various women. He went to their apartments alone. He liked the company of women. He was a very reserved man. He was a very intelligent man. He had a very good memory. All of these things, none of which, looked at in the cold light of day, proved anything, collectively confirmed in the mind, particularly of the graphologist, that is the handwriting expert in the French intelligence service, a man called Major Dupaty de Clam, who identified Dreyfus's handwriting as the closest match, not an exact match. You might think you need an exact match. Close isn't really good enough with handwriting. But they had a reason to think that it was a proof, because a real spy, a spy as intelligent, as devious, as Jewish as Dreyfus, would know to slightly disguise his handwriting, just in case he got caught. So actually, the fact it was a near but not exact match was confirming evidence that they'd found their man. And they got him in the initial interrogation, when they brought him in to question him about this, to, without telling him why, write down under dictation the exact words in the bordereau. So they made him write on a piece of paper everything that it said on the incriminating document. And then they put these two documents side by side, and they said they look similar, which of course they would do if you have exactly the same words. They were convinced that they had their man. As Zola said in J'accuse, it was absurd. The evidence against Dreyfus was absurd. So Zola in J'accuse, when he's going through the ridiculousness of the original charges against Dreyfus, summed it up like this. Here's the case against Dreyfus. Dreyfus knows several languages. Crime. No compromising papers were found with him. Crime. He sometimes goes to his country of origin, Alsace. Crime. He is hard-working. He is anxious to know everything. Another crime. He is not troubled. A crime. He is confused. A crime. And what Zola's referring to there is that much was made of the fact that when Dreyfus was arrested and interrogated, he was clearly appalled. He was sort of frozen in shock. But he wasn't indignant. He wasn't outraged. He was not calm, but they thought he was cold. They thought he was calculating. Everything was fed through a series of stereotypes. They had a stereotype of a traitor. They had a stereotype of a man who was too clever by half. They had a stereotype of a man who was cold and devious. They had a stereotype of a Jew. And that's what they saw before him. So they charged him, and he was brought before a military tribunal, a court-martial. He got legal representation. The evidence was presented against him, and the evidence was nothing more than I've described here. They didn't have any extra stuff to pin on him. It was all circumstantial. Most of it hung on a handwriting test, which actually, if anything, exonerated him, but was close. His character was put through the microscope and found wanting on every front. Too cold, too unfaithful, too devious, too clever. His memory's too good. He speaks too many languages. He's not French. He's not really French. But in the court-martial, which was held in camera in secret, so the journalists were all cleared out, and by this point there was huge press interest in this case because the military had been briefing against Dreyfus. There were lots of newspapers that hung on the words, often delivered privately or in secret, of senior army officers. And the word had been put out that they had their man. They'd found a Jewish traitor at the heart of the military establishment, and he would be hung out to dry. The press were prejudiced against Dreyfus. But just to be clear to the 7 members of the military tribunal that were going to judge him, secretly, in a secret court, a secret dossier of secret documents was given to the judges without Dreyfus or his lawyers knowing anything about it. A grotesque, monstrous breach of legal procedure. This was meant to be a formal legal hearing, But the man who was charged discovered long afterwards that his judges had been shown a series of documents about which he knew nothing, which his lawyers were not allowed to study, that he was not allowed to question or challenge. And these documents included a telegram communication between Schwarzkoppen and a man in the Italian embassy who subsequently turned out to be his male lover, in which they talked to each other about someone who was referred to as the scoundrel D, just the initial D, D full stop. But here was the man to whom the bordereau was addressed, Schwarzkoppen. And here he was talking to another man in another foreign embassy about someone whose name begins with the same letter as Dreyfus and whom they call a scoundrel. That's it. Even the people who were prosecuting Dreyfus knew that wasn't definitive. So along with that document, there was another document in which Dreyfus was named. So it wasn't just D, it was the name Dreyfus, named by these diplomats discussing possible sources of information. And that document was just a straight forgery. A man called Henri, Major Henri, who worked in the intelligence service, was tasked with just beefing up the case against Dreyfus. The D telegram was real, but it proved nothing. The only thing that named Dreyfus was just fake, but it was put alongside real documents, and it was shown to these judges so that they could be confident that there was something more going on here at the level of national security. So one of the challenges was that Schwarzkoppen and other members of the German embassy couldn't be brought as witnesses, not only because they couldn't be relied on, but because there was an understanding that there was a sort of diplomatic embargo around some of the evidence of the people who knew what was going on. The Germans were not going to get involved in this. The Italians were not going to get involved in this. But what the prosecutors wanted the judges to know is that they were dealing with a matter of national security in which there were people in the know. There was more information than could be presented in a court of law, even a secret hearing, the sort of information that has to pass privately between people who, with a nod and a wink, understand what they're being told. And so there was a dossier, a secret dossier, which was part of these proceedings but known to no one except the prosecutors and the judges. And Dreyfus was convicted. He was convicted not only on the basis of what was said in court, but on the basis of what was in the secret dossier. He was sentenced to disgrace, public disgrace and humiliation, and then he was sent to a place that was rightfully known as Devil's Island. It was a hellish place where he was to be kept permanently, and he was to be guarded permanently. There would be a set of soldiers there whose job was simply to keep Dreyfus away from all human contact. There were many other convicts there. Devil's Island was a place that you really didn't want to be sent, including political convicts there. But Dreyfus was a man apart. By this point, he was the most notorious man in the French Republic. And he was a symbol of the rottenness at the heart of the Republic, the foreign rottenness, the corruption, the outsiders, the Jews, the conspirators, the people who wanted to bring France down, the non-French people who had infiltrated to the heart of the state. And he would be kept there indefinitely. He would not be executed. He would suffer, and he thought it too. Dreyfus thought it too. He asked to be executed, though he never wavered in his insistence on his innocence. But the fate that was given him was one he couldn't tolerate. And one of the remarkable things about this first step in the Dreyfus Affair, given how it was going to divide France and become the central political fissure in French politics right through to the 20th century, is that initially almost everyone was happy with the outcome. People on the right, it confirmed what they thought. Jews weren't to be trusted. Only true Frenchmen should have positions of authority. There probably were conspiracies, not just involving the Jews, but Freemasons, Protestants, atheists, outsiders, communists. And it was crucial to root out the rottenness, to purify the state. People on the left also celebrated Dreyfus's conviction, because the other thing about Dreyfus is that he was a wealthy man from a wealthy Jewish family. And there was plenty of anti-Semitism on the left too. And their fear had been that this well-connected man, getting close to the top of the military establishment, would buy his way out. That's what people on the left thought happened in the French Republic. The corruption was the corruption not of foreigners and outsiders, but of money. And to see Dreyfus convicted and condemned seemed to show that you couldn't buy your way out. The fear was that he would. He would bribe his way out. Here were the forces of law and order holding firm. This was so serious. Nothing would be allowed to interfere with the process of law. And in some ways, the deepest irony of all is that Dreyfus himself half fell for the case against him, in the sense that part of his horror was being accused of this crime. But part of his horror, and he said this repeatedly under interrogation, was that he knew he didn't do it, which meant there was another traitor out there. And he was appalled to think that someone was selling military secrets to the Germans. And he was doubly appalled to think that if it was pinned on him, the real traitor would not be discovered, would have got away with it. And he said this was the thing that gave him most anguish. The idea that because he knew he was innocent, he knew that a real traitor was getting away with it. He was not just a good French patriot, he was incredibly loyal to the idea, the ideal of the French army as the guardian of the nation. The French army liked to present itself as the one thing in a country which was deeply suspicious of its politics, constantly seeing political scandals unfolding, being exposed by the newspapers, highly partisan, deeply divided on political lines, on religious lines, Catholic, Protestant, never mind the Jews, on ideological lines, different understandings of history, of the French Revolution and what it meant. In that febrile, divided world, the army symbolized national unity. And Dreyfus completely believed that, and was appalled to think that the one bulwark between the French nation and essentially anarchy had something rotten at its heart. Many years later, as the Dreyfus Affair was coming to an end, one of the people who became a leading Dreyfusard, a young socialist called Léon Blum, who went on to become a very significant French politician and indeed prime minister later on in the 1930s. But as a young man, he said of the Dreyfus Affairs, one of the things that had often troubled him was the question, if Dreyfus hadn't actually been the man in the dock, would Dreyfus have been a Dreyfusard? Would this man actually have seen what was going on, which was the corruption, the rottenness at the heart of the army, was the army command itself? It wasn't a spy, it wasn't a traitor, it wasn't some nefarious force as part of a conspiracy. The real conspiracy was the army. Would Dreyfus himself have seen that? And there is reason to think that he wouldn't have seen it. He was completely sold on the army's self-image. That was part of his tragedy. That was part of the reason he didn't behave in a way that they thought a man who was innocent should behave, because he shared their outrage. So when the first court-martial took place and Dreyfus was sent to Devil's Island, there was a hope that the affair, it wasn't yet called an affair, the case of Dreyfus, would move to the margins of French life. The man had been caught, he had been duly punished, he'd been made an example of. Everyone could agree that something terrible had been averted, and they could get back to hating each other in their traditional ways. And it was only really by chance, and also because, among a few other people, Dreyfus's brother, Mathieu Dreyfus, from the outset was determined to clear his brother's name, and his wife, Lucy Dreyfus, also never doubted his innocence for a moment. And the Dreyfus family did have money, and they were able to buy lawyers, pay for people to investigate, private investigators, and they kept the case alive. But it was really by chance that a new chief of the French intelligence service, a man called Colonel Picard, Georges Picard, stumbled across evidence that suggested, on the only thing that really mattered in this case, who wrote the bordereau, whose handwriting was it, that there was a much better fit. There was a man whose handwriting was not a near match, but an exact match. A man who, if you looked at his background, had many, many more reasons for any investigator to think there was something not right here. He wasn't a Jew. He was called Major Esterhazy. He was of Hungarian origin. But he was a pretty rackety gentleman. He was heavily in debt. He dabbled in all sorts of different kinds of journalism, so he was a pretty leaky bucket. He had some pretty dubious political views, not maybe by the standards of the establishment, but he was willing to embrace various kinds of, among other things, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorizing. He peddled what he thought people who would pay him money wanted to hear. in that age, if you were willing to peddle anti-Semitism, there was always a buyer in that market. He would sell people what he thought they wanted to hear. As journalism, there was no reason to think that he was also a spy, except his handwriting was an exact match. In fact, extraordinarily, one of the things that Mathieu Dreyfus did in trying to just get some momentum behind the thought that his brother's case needed to be re-examined was that he paid for a series of posters to be put up around Paris on lampposts, on billboards, which was just a series of images of the bordereau and of Dreyfus's handwriting. He just plastered Paris with these two images in order to show people that they did not match. If this was the evidence against his brother, the evidence was hollow. It didn't make much difference. No one was interested in that point in this being rehashed. Most people had moved on, but one person saw a poster and recognized, because he happened to have done some business with Esterhazy, that it was Esterhazy's handwriting and went to the authorities. It confirmed what Picard by this point was suspecting. They'd got the wrong man. And so Picard went to his seniors. So a lot of people very high up in French military politics, a man called General Mercier, the war minister, a man called Boisdeffre, who was the head of the chiefs of staff, the most senior man in the army. These people had all signed off on Dreyfus's conviction. They were convinced, or had allowed themselves to be convinced, that they'd got their man, and they had no interest in reopening the case. When Picard took to his seniors the evidence that they had got the wrong man, they immediately decided they had to take action. What they needed to do was bring in Esterhazy, question him, and then court-martial him. He needed to be court-martialed. So the second court-martial was the court-martialing of Major Esterhazy, the man whose handwriting was a match for the bordereau, and the man who, if you look at it in the right light, is a much better fit for someone selling secrets. And they convened this court-martial with one purpose only, which was to acquit him. They realized it wouldn't be enough simply to bury the evidence. There had to be another legal proceeding in which Esterhazy was completely cleared of all the charges against him and was exonerated as a man of honor. And that's what happened. In the second court-martial, the fix was in. It was entirely contrived in order to dispel the growing rumors and the growing public interest in the idea that Dreyfus might not be guilty. And of course it didn't work, because for the people who are starting to suspect that this case was rotten, this court-martial did nothing to convince them of anything other than that there was a large and growing conspiracy. The cover-up was now visible. And that provoked perhaps the decisive event in the entire Dreyfus Affair. It took time. None of this happened straight away. This was drawn out through 1894, 1895, 1896, 1897, 1898. Zola publishes J'accuse, which was deliberately designed to provoke another legal proceeding, a different one, this time in front of a jury, this time in open court, public court, so no secret in-camera stuff, no secret documents being shown to the judges. This had to be a fully public hearing. It was a libel case. Zola in J'accuse named and accused a series of people, including Mercier, the war minister, Boisdeffre, the most senior man in the army, du Paty de Clam, the officer who had first identified Dreyfus's handwriting. He named names, going through all of them, and he accused them in a way that he thought required them to sue him for libel. They couldn't let it stand. He basically accused each of them of fixing the verdict, of concocting the evidence, and of being involved in a cover-up. So if it wasn't true, they were going to have to prove it in court. So a libel case was indeed brought by all of these gentlemen against Zola. And by this point, the press was hysterical. Every newspaper of every stripe, every political temperament had a view on the Dreyfus Affair, almost all of them by this point predictable. If you were inclined to think that the conspiracy was a Jewish Freemason communist conspiracy, there were newspapers for that. If you were inclined to think it was a Catholic conspiracy, that Jesuits were secretly running the army and the Republic, and that they had picked on a Jew as their scapegoat to cover up for their crimes, there were newspapers for that. If you were on the left, you were much more likely to be a Dreyfusard. If you were on the right, you were much more likely to be an anti-Dreyfusard. If you were a Catholic, you were much more likely to think Dreyfus was guilty. If you weren't a Catholic, in whatever permutation there is of not being a Catholic, and there are many, you were more likely to think that Dreyfus was innocent. There was a hysterical level of attention in the Zola libel trial. The jury was a jury of Parisians. It happened in Paris, but they were merchants and artisans. And one of the things that had happened by this point in the Dreyfus Affair is the other great divide that seemed to have opened up, certainly in the eyes of the people who were convinced that Dreyfus was guilty, was between the people, the good, solid Catholic people of France, the people who made the nation, the honest people, people of true French heritage, the people who would fight in the army, who would fight in the next war against Germany, the people who could be relied on, and a group of people who had come to be known as the intellectuals, the writers, the artists, the philosophers, the lawyers, intellectual professions which tended to be dominated, it was believed, by Jews and by atheists and by Freemasons and by Protestants, not by good, honest Catholic stock. Zola was deeply suspicious on all these counts. He was not Jewish. He had written in defense of the Jews in his career, but he'd also, like Dickens and other novelists of the time, he'd include many grotesque Jewish stereotypes in his novels, and even his defense of Jews, his attack on anti-Semitism, tended to trade in the stereotypes. The reason that people hate the Jews is because Jews are like this. They're money grubbing. It's not fair to hate them. It's not right. It's used in ways that are wrong and evil. But you can see why it happens. Zola was that kind of anti-Semite. He was himself of Italian origin, so he wasn't genuinely French, and he was a writer of fiction. He was a novelist. As someone said of Zola's J'accuse, the intervention of a novelist, even a famous one, in a matter of military justice seems to me as out of place as the intervention in a question concerning the origins of Romanticism of a colonel in the police force. This was a category mistake. Military justice, which is formal and procedural, was now being questioned by a man who made things up for a living. So Zola was sued for libel, and these men came and gave evidence against Zola. The case was made that Dreyfus was innocent, that the handwriting showed it was Esterhazy. By this point, a number of people actually knew, including Picard, that it was Esterhazy. But Picard, by this point, was being smeared by the army. Rumours were being put about in the press. The classic smear of the time, because we are now after the trial of Oscar Wilde, is that Picard was gay, that he frequented male brothels. That was always the, if in doubt, throw that one at them. And try and associate it with Wilde if you can, and some of the notorious cases that had happened across the Channel. Picard had been smeared in all sorts of ways. He'd been sent away from his duties. He was under arrest. He was facing court-martial for having uncovered the man who sent the bordereau. The cover-up was in, but it had to be made in court. So the evidence that Dreyfus did it was not strong. And by this point, it was so weak, so thin, the secret dossier couldn't be produced because it contained a forgery. It could be hinted at. Other things were hinted at. A rumour was widely believed that the Kaiser had in his possession a letter from Dreyfus asking for German citizenship in return for selling secrets. There was no such letter, but the people who circulated the rumour knew that the Kaiser wasn't going to deny it because the Kaiser was not in the business of denying tittle-tattle. He wouldn't lower himself to that level. The Germans generally would not lower themselves to the level of the Dreyfus Affair, which was not good for Dreyfus because Schwarzkoppen knew it was Esterhazy, but he couldn't be summoned as a witness. He had diplomatic immunity. But still, there was no case by this point against Dreyfus. So the generals fell back on the defense in political trials, which is always the final defense. I've referred to it time and again in this series, which is, by this point, if you are to find against us, if you are to acquit this person who we're now admitting may or may not have done it, we have passed the point of no return. To exonerate him would be to condemn us. If you let Socrates go, if you let Joan of Arc go, in a way, it doesn't matter anymore whether they are guilty as charged. You will break the state, inflame the situation, unleash violence. Boisdeffre, in his testimony at Zola's trial, the libel trial, where he prosecuted Zola for libel, said to the jury, This isn't about Dreyfus anymore. This is about the army and whether the French people have faith in the army, because he said to them, a war is coming. A war is coming. And you have to think about whether, when that war comes, people still have faith in the army or not. That is the question for you in this trial. It's a question of faith. Do you still have faith in the one institution that can save this rickety republic? He said to the jury, what do you want for the poor soldiers who will be led into fire by leaders that have been demeaned in their eyes? That is, if you find for Zola, you will send us into the next war with soldiers who no longer believe in their generals, people like us. It is to the slaughterhouse that your sons will be led, gentlemen of the jury. And then he said, now, gentlemen, let me conclude by saying one thing. You are the jury. You are the nation. Good, honest merchants and artisans, not an intellectual among them. If the nation does not have confidence in the leaders of its army, in those who bear the responsibility for its defence, they are ready to hand over that onerous task to others. You have only to speak. I will say nothing more. It was no longer about Dreyfus. It was about whether the nation had confidence in the army. And the jury found, against Zola, for Mercier and Boisdeffre and du Paty de Clam. And Zola was convicted. He had to go into exile. He was fined. He would have been jailed if he'd stayed in the country. Anti-Semitic riots broke out across France. There was a kind of bursting of the bubble of tension that had been building up around that trial, and it came out as a kind of exultant revenge against the outsiders. The things that Boisdeffre said in that trial spoke to a nation that was looking for some way to assert its faith in its institutions, and it had almost no faith in its institutions at this point. So it took it as an opportunity to let the blood of the Jews. But still the case continued, and more evidence built that Dreyfus's conviction was unsound, but also the Dreyfusard cause grew. It grew in political strength. Alliances were made between Republicans, centrists, and socialists around the Dreyfus case. The balance of power in French politics started to shift. Politicians saw they could use the Dreyfus case in order to attack not the army as such, but a different kind of corruption, the corruption of the elite, the establishment, of the Jesuits, of those in the know, of the secret services, in the name of openness, justice, social solidarity. There was a rival story, a rival conspiracy theory to be told. And these were tested in elections, these theories. Elections turned on these questions in the era of the Dreyfus Affair. It wasn't about did Dreyfus do it or didn't he do it? It was about which of these narratives are you now more comfortable with? And it was a real contest. In some parts of the country, the anti-Dreyfusards romped home in elections, but in other places, the Dreyfusards were building in strength. And the pressure grew to the point that the army could no longer resist, bringing Dreyfus back for a retrial, which happened in 1899 at a place called Rennes in France. Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island, where he'd been kept in terrible conditions for nearly 5 years. He had at one point been chained to his bed. He lived in a little hut which was surrounded by a wall to prevent him from escaping, under armed guard. No air got in, no light got in. It was horrific, and it had broken him. He was physically broken by the experience, but he came back. He still had his dignity. His wife had stood by him. He saw his children again. His brother had stood by him. He now had good lawyers, though the lawyers couldn't agree on the strategy to use in the new court-martial. But it seemed like a foregone conclusion because there was now no evidence against Dreyfus, and there was overwhelming evidence against Esterhazy. Everybody in the know knew it was Esterhazy on both sides. They knew that Esterhazy's court-martial had been a sham. They knew the case against Dreyfus was a sham. And so it had to be rerun. Dreyfus's lawyers couldn't agree whether they should go down the conspiracy theory route and expose the entire charade of establishment connivance in Dreyfus's false conviction and outrageous punishment, whether they should try and bring down the House of Cards, or whether they should show deference to the court, do the procedural thing. It's a serious court-martial. These are serious people. They are trying to come to the truth and simply methodically go through the evidence. And Dreyfus had two lawyers, one of whom, encouraged by various people, including the politician Clemenceau, who is now a committed Dreyfusard, having initially, after Dreyfus's conviction, said, good riddance to bad rubbish. There goes another rich Jew. Thank God we got rid of him. But now Clemenceau was convinced that Dreyfus was the vehicle, essentially, to political power. And he wanted this case to be the exposing of the other side. But there was also pressure from some people to resist playing the other side at their game and simply to make it clear that their man could not have done what he was accused of. So the defense wasn't completely consistent. The prosecution, who you might think would throw in the towel, did the opposite. And the second court-martial dragged on and on because every single piece of evidence was rehearsed. Witnesses upon witnesses were summoned. Documents relating to Dreyfus's relationships with the women whose apartments that he visited, relating to his army training, to the kinds of things he might see. All of the old charges against him, he knows too many languages, he has too good a memory. And the definitive charge of all, if he was innocent, why does he behave like a guilty man? Why is he so shifty? Look at him now. His answers are monosyllabic. The word that was used is his voice is metallic. It's lacking in emotion. When he denies what's put to him, he doesn't sound like a man who is outraged. Where is the outrage? It can all be summed up by almost the last question that was put to Dreyfus in this court-martial, the second one, right at the end of his excruciating interrogation, in which he had to deny over again all of the things that had been put to him first time. Nothing was left out. Nothing was thought out of bounds because in the intervening years, the whole thing had been shown to be a sham. The sham was reassembled. More evidence was added. The rumors were alluded to. The Kaiser, the women, the money, the thought that Esterhazy couldn't be the man who did it, because everybody knows that when a Jew, particularly a wealthy Jew, is convicted, a thing called the Jewish syndicate, which is the Rothschilds and others, the people who have the real money and the real power, they always get together and they always have on standby a stooge, someone who they will try and pin it on. And the thing about Esterhazy is he's a classic stooge. He's exactly the kind of person they would pin it on. And the case was made. The handwriting is too neat a match. Esterhazy wouldn't have written in his own hand. A true spy would have disguised his handwriting as someone else's handwriting, which is what Jews do. Throughout the history of anti-Semitism, one of the tropes is Jews are shapeshifters. One of the reasons you can't rely on Jews is you can never be quite sure who they are. And they're very good at finding other people to stand in for them. This was the case against Dreyfus second time around. Rumour, supposition, forgery, fraudulence, the lot. And the last question that was put to Dreyfus, a rumour had always circulated that just before his sword was broken and his epaulets were cut off, he had admitted to someone who was leading him to his public disgrace that he was guilty. He never had, he never did. But that rumour had been allowed to spread. But one thing it did seem that he said as he was led away is that he would be exonerated. It might take 3 years, he said. In the end, it took more. But he would be exonerated. And the last question that was put to him in his court-martial was, if you're innocent, why did you think it would take 3 years to exonerate you? An innocent man would say, I am innocent, and the evidence of my innocence should be available now. Why did you think it would take 3 years? Why did you need 3 years? This is the syndicate. This is the stooge. You needed time to assemble your conspiracy. An innocent man would not have said, I need 3 years. Probably the reason that Dreyfus said he needed 3 years is that he was still at that point convinced, A, that his superior officers were well-intentioned people who wanted to find the real spy, and that they had made a mistake. And it would take time to undo that mistake, but they would be methodical, they would be rigorous, and in the end, they would investigate to the point they would find the true traitor. He probably said it would take 3 years because he still had faith in the army that he served. And in his second court-martial, he was confronted with these men in whom he'd had faith, who it turned out had contrived to forge evidence against him and to punish him. By the time of the second court-martial, Boisdeffre was a broken man. And he said on the stand, "I understand less and less, for I can neither accept what you say nor refute it. There is nothing left for me but to disappear. I'm finished. I'm finished." He couldn't accept it. He couldn't refute it. He had nothing left to say. The case against Dreyfus was completely hollow. It was a kind of assemblage of nonsense upon nonsense upon nonsense. And the final attempt to prosecute him just tried to pile so much nonsense on so much nonsense in this formal legal setting that it was hoped that it would be enough to persuade the 7 judges, military men, that deep down the survival of the army was at stake. And it worked. He was convicted again by 5-2. Not unanimous. 2 people weren't willing to go along with it, but 5 were. And the verdict was completely extraordinary, the judgment. It made no sense. He was found guilty again, but the sentence was reduced to 10 years from life because it was said there were extenuating circumstances. There were no extenuating circumstances. There was nothing presented in that court that extenuated his treason. If it was treason, it was treason. If it wasn't treason, he was a victim of a crime himself. Nobody said anything to extenuate the charge. But because they knew that the case against him was unsustainable, the only language they could find to convey to the world that they were doing this reluctantly was extenuating circumstances. From here, the path to Dreyfus's eventual clearing and exoneration was still long. 1906, when he was finally exonerated. But political pressure built after the outrage of the second court-martial for Dreyfus to be pardoned. Dreyfus did not want to be pardoned. He wanted a third court-martial. He thought pardoning implied that he was guilty, but he was persuaded by his lawyer, among others, that if he was pardoned, he could live again peacefully with his family, with his children. He wouldn't be incarcerated. And there would be time for the political pressure to build for a full exoneration. And in the end, he accepted that. He accepted the pardon. And that advice was good advice. The balance of power in France shifted. It shifted towards the centrist Republicans in alliance with the socialists, who made Dreyfus their cause. Clemenceau became a power in the land. And they moved towards a final re-examining of the case in a political commission, a courtroom convened in the French Parliament, essentially a legal tribunal made up of politicians. And the politicians, unlike the military people, knew how to do this. They also exceeded their legal brief. The anti-Dreyfusards said when Dreyfus's conviction was quashed that it was an outrage because this parliamentary tribunal did not have the power to quash a legal conviction. It needed another court-martial. But by that point, the anti-Dreyfusards were in the retreat. The other conspiracy theory was rampant. The French army was being purged of its Jesuits, of its suspicious Catholics. The Republic was being refashioned in the image of a new kind of social republic, a left-leaning republic, Clemenceau's republic. And Dreyfus was cleared. And eventually he was reinstated. He was reinstated at a rank that seemed commensurate with where he would have reached. He was given pay, though he was not given back pay, and he was outraged by that. For the time of his incarceration on Devil's Island, he wasn't paid. And the story ended there in a way. The poison that the Dreyfus Affair introduced into French life took decades to go, if it ever went. Some people still see it there now. The thing that changed everything was the thing that the whole Dreyfus Affair originally was about. The thing that motivated it, that drove it, which is something is coming and the nation needs to be ready for it. And the only way the nation can be ready for it is to put its faith in the army. The thing that was coming, believed to be coming in 1894, was another war with Germany. And it did arrive. It took 2 decades to arrive, but it did arrive in 1914. And when it arrived, the people who were still alive from the Dreyfus Affair all fought on the same side. Dreyfus and Dupaty de Clam, the man who had identified the handwriting. Dreyfus wasn't well enough to actively fight, but he nonetheless was re-enlisted. Dupaty de Clam was killed in action. There was no difference between the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards in the sense that they all did rally. The thing that was feared, which is the Dreyfus case, illustrated the risk that when the war came, France would split. Well, France had split. The Dreyfus case had split it down the middle, top to bottom, side to side. Split families, political parties, communities. And when the war came, the split disappeared. The other thing about the Dreyfus Affair is that the 1890s, a long time ago, feel very now. As I was reading about it and thinking about it, I also found myself thinking about Washington, D.C. in 2025. I found myself reading an article in the New York Times, which was headlined, "Washington is now a hotbed of competing conspiracy theories." It's conspiracy theory versus conspiracy theory. Is your conspiracy theory about the Russia hoax, or is it about Jeffrey Epstein? Is it about Trump being the conspirator or Trump being the victim of the conspiracy? And political parties have been sucked into this. Political organization in Washington turns on fealty to the conspiracy theory. And it's being fueled by a media in which you can find a platform for any theory you like. It's a kind of DIY media landscape. Websites and newsletters and YouTube channels. People can publish their own stuff. And if you want a version of the theory appearing in what looks like a reputable publication, you can find it because there are lots of publications, none of them reputable, but mimicking or aping the look of something formally correct, which will tell you whatever you need to hear. That's true in 2025. We've been through a technology revolution that's made it possible, but it was true in Paris in the 1890s. There were so many different newspapers. There was so much self-publishing going on. It was a DIY news culture. There were newspapers like Le Figaro that dominated, but Le Figaro panicked during the Dreyfus Affair. It thought it was losing readers by siding with Dreyfus, and it became ostensibly neutral. Welcome to the world of the Washington Post. But there are also little papers, party papers, literally DIY stuff. Mathieu Dreyfus plastering the lampposts of Paris with images of the bordereau and of Dreyfus's handwriting. It feels like the age of the internet, and the conspiracy theories flourished and they divided, and political parties were organized around them. And it happened in the shadow of war. Behind all of this stuff in Washington now is the fear of the thing that may be coming, which is the war with China. The Russia hoax, the Epstein story, they are secondary to the real fear, in the way that Dreyfus was kind of secondary to the real fear that France had lost a war once and it was going to lose it again. And it wasn't going to lose it because of the Jews. It was going to lose it because it was no longer a properly functioning state capable of defending itself. And that fear is there in Washington, D.C. in 2025. And it lies behind the madness. There is no Dreyfus. I don't know who Dreyfus is in the Washington 2025 version. I don't think it's Epstein. I don't think it's Ghislaine Maxwell. But it doesn't really matter. There doesn't need to be a Dreyfus. In the end, it didn't matter. Dreyfus, as Bloom said, maybe wasn't even a Dreyfusard. It all becomes a cipher for something else. In the end, the emptiness at the heart of this thing is an irrelevance. What matters is what's laid over it. Formal layer, informal layer, formal layer, informal layer, until no one can see anymore what lies behind it. In the end, the truth came out. But by the time the truth came out, it was too late. It was too late for Dreyfus. The damage had been done. The country had been split. The politics of the country had reimagined itself in this conspiratorial mindset. The boil wasn't lanced by Dreyfus's exoneration. The people who believed that Dreyfus had been exonerated because of the Jewish syndicate and the stooge and the money and the Rothschilds didn't cease to believe that when Dreyfus was exonerated. They believed they'd been proved right. There are lots of studies of what happens when, in a very divided landscape, say over something like climate change, more facts are introduced into the argument. Take two groups of people who fundamentally disagree about whether climate change is real or not, and then give them as many unambiguous facts as possible, facts that are agreed on by the experts, and then see at the end of it whether they are more divided or less divided. Those experiments show that if you introduce into a divided group facts, the divide gets wider. Each side interprets the facts in their own way. It's more like watching a football crowd than it is like watching a deliberative democratic assembly. Introduce facts into the Dreyfus Affair. He didn't write the bordereau. Esterhazy wrote it. It's his handwriting. All of the evidence points his way. And the people who believed Dreyfus was guilty were more convinced that he was guilty. Because what could be clearer evidence of a conspiracy than the fact that they've now found someone on whom they're trying to pin the old handwriting trick? It doesn't matter who Dreyfus is in 2025 in Washington. It's a Dreyfusard age. And then I want to say one last thing, because it connects to last week's episode. So much in the Dreyfus Affair, so many fascinating tiny details, but one of the little details that is haunting, which is that Oscar Wilde, after he'd done his hard labour and was disgraced, came to live out his final days in Paris. And the Paris he came to was the Paris of the Dreyfus Affair, the height of the affair. In the late 1890s, Wilde was there. And by this point, a number of people knew that Esterhazy, not Dreyfus, was the spy. But even calling him a spy is an exaggeration. One of the things that was noticed is that most of the information that Esterhazy was offering the Germans was in the public domain. Actually, the mistake that was made right at the beginning was to think that the bordereau contained anything particularly confidential. That information about the gun, about the troop movements, about Madagascar could be gleaned from a careful reading of public military journals, which is what Esterhazy did. He sold information to people that was publicly available, but he dressed it up as secret, which is one of the reasons why the anti-Dreyfusards were convinced that Esterhazy was a double agent. And actually, he was not the spy. He was working for the French army, and Dreyfus was still the villain. On it goes. Wilde arrived in that city, and almost no one would be his friend. His friends had abandoned him. One or two people still tried to look out for him and look after him, including one man who thought he could galvanize Wilde back into life by telling him the inside story of the Dreyfus Affair. He told him that Esterhazy, he knew for a fact, that Esterhazy was the author of the bordereau. But by that point, almost the only person that Oscar Wilde had befriended in Paris was Esterhazy. There was a brief period when Oscar Wilde and Esterhazy were drinking companions in Paris, when Esterhazy was widely suspected of being the originator of the bordereau, when Wilde was in disgrace, and they told each other their stories. And then Wilde was informed by someone in the know that actually Esterhazy was not a victim here. Esterhazy was the man responsible for this. And Wilde didn't care. He wasn't interested. He didn't care what Esterhazy had done. It didn't galvanize him. It bored him. Oscar Wilde was probably the only person in Paris in the late 1890s who was bored, indifferent to the Dreyfus Affair. Who cares? He thought Esterhazy was entertaining, and who else was he going to drink with? He was reduced to the rackety majors. So he did it. So he didn't do it. So he was a cipher. So he was a victim. After what Wilde had been through, he didn't care. The only man in Paris who didn't care about the Dreyfus Affair was the one man in Paris who knew what it meant to become a cipher for the terrors and the hypocrisies of the age. Next time in Politics on Trial, something a little bit different, though not disconnected from what I've just been talking about. It's also a little bit out of sequence, but 2025 is the 100th anniversary of the best-known novel with the word trial in its title. It is by Kafka, and it is called The Trial, and it is one of the towering works of 20th century literature that has given us, among other things, the word Kafkaesque. And what I've just been talking about feels like something to which the word Kafkaesque could be applied. I think Dreyfus would feel some recognition in the way we use that term. But next time I'm going to be talking to Ian Ellison about Kafka's The Trial and asking the question, have we understood the term Kafkaesque correctly? Because the real mystery about this novel, where is the trial? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.